At home, we have a tradition. My mom and one of my brothers likes to always compete with each other. With the Sunday comics, there's the Spot the Six Differences. Maybe some of the kids especially are familiar with this, and they'll try to race to see who can spot the six differences first. And our readings today almost invite a similar approach, although maybe first spotting the similarities, but then noticing some key differences. And as I mentioned at the beginning, especially we look at our first reading today and our gospel, because they actually have much in common, even though they're different stories. We hear in both cases a story, though, of hospitality, specifically of people welcoming the Lord himself into their homes. And so in that first reading, we had Abraham and Sarah welcome these three visitors, but they're addressed as the Lord. And some icons have even depicted these three as the persons of the Trinity. So they're welcoming God into their home, and they seek to serve him. And in our gospel, this almost the same thing happens. Mary and Martha welcome Jesus, the Lord, again into their home, and again seek to serve him. And so you can see we sort of have parallel stories. But there are also some key differences, and one of the main ones is the way that they're responded to by the Lord. So in the first reading, Abraham and Sarah are really extolled for their service and given a great blessing. But in our gospel, something seems to go wrong. Things seem to go off the rails, and Martha sort of falls apart, and Jesus speaks these words of encouragement, but also instruction to her. And I was puzzled about why this happens, because Martha seems to do the same thing as Abraham and Sarah in our first reading. She seeks to serve the Lord, she works very hard, and yet something seems to go wrong. And so there are maybe a couple of theories or of explanations of what goes wrong with Martha's experience and how these actually can apply to our own lives. Because in many ways, Martha's experience, as well as Abraham and Sarah's, is ours too. And so we can learn something by looking a little bit closer at each of these stories. So one explanation of what goes wrong with Martha's experience is a sort of general challenge of actually one of the seven deadly sins called acedia, or sloth. And maybe you're familiar with this. It's interesting that acedia is sometimes also called a spiritual sadness, and we often call it sloth, but it's a misnomer. We might think that means laziness, but often it takes the opposite form. Rather than being laziness, often acedia means being very busy, very occupied, but with lots of tasks other than the one thing that really needs to be done. In the tradition of the spiritual tradition, they'll talk about monks struggling with this, and it describes the monk. It says, he feels an overwhelming desire to cease the work at hand, to leave his cell in search of conversation or new work or a new cell. He feels a feeling of alienation from work, place, and community. In other words, acedia is this sense of avoiding the one really important thing to do lots of other things instead. Anyone who's ever had to write an essay for school maybe knows this experience. Rather than working on the essay, you'll go and clean your room or go and work on all those other tasks you've done. Maybe this happens at home too. Suddenly do lots of work around the house rather than the one thing that really needs to be done. I even had this experience myself a few weeks ago as I was packing up at the end of my previous assignment. I was very productive for about 2 weeks because I was avoiding actually packing up. I was intimidated by it. But was also avoiding maybe a deeper spiritual reality, which was really acknowledging the fact that life was changing and I needed to say goodbye and turning to the Lord in the midst of that. And so I found myself very busy doing lots of good things, but avoiding really that one important thing. And the fact is that sometimes it's easier to focus on our to-do list and whatever other things are going on than to focus on Jesus, than to focus on the Lord. We can sometimes be more preoccupied with various concerns and worries, and slowly Jesus is pushed out of the field of view. And I wonder if this is what happened with Martha. We kind of see Mary as a contrast. Mary is sitting, focused on Jesus. Martha becomes very caught up in lots of activity, but maybe she lost track of Jesus in the midst of all of that. And this can happen for each of us, especially with prayer. We allow ourselves to begin to avoid prayer, instead doing lots of practical things, lots of productive things, and this helps us justify it, but we're avoiding that one key thing. And in the end, we feel almost a sense of betrayal that we did all this work and yet we still feel somewhat empty or listless, adrift afterwards. And this happens to Martha. She feels betrayed in her efforts to serve the Lord. But where does that betrayal come from? We can look again at the gospel, and this maybe takes us to the second explanation. So in the gospel, it says, Martha, burdened with much serving, came to Jesus and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me by myself to do the serving? You can hear the anguish, the frustration in her voice. And so perhaps it's this acedia, this getting caught up in other things, but also there's something maybe deeper going on. That what began as a sincere effort to serve Jesus, to do an act of charity on Martha's part, has begun to turn in on itself. That Martha becomes anxious and worried, preoccupied with her own project rather than the Lord herself. I read a scripture commentary to kind of try and understand this further, and they said, in the parable of the sower, just a couple chapters earlier, Jesus had warned that anxieties can, like thorns, choke a person's response to the word. And he later cautions against being anxious and allowing oneself to be weighed down with the anxieties of life. Certainly, Martha's anxieties spring from her desires to serve Jesus, not from the pursuit of any sinful ways. And so it's not that Martha's doing work is bad, because the first reading had work as well, but it's that somehow her act of charity has now become a distraction, an obstacle to her closeness to Jesus. And so she begins to feel betrayed or abandoned by the sister who is not helping, betrayed by Jesus who seems to not care, or at least that's her impression. And so rather than being drawn to Jesus by her work, she's now beginning to feel separated from him. And as a result, she starts to kind of tear away even at her sister Mary. She tries to pull her away from Jesus as well. I have to say that Martha's experience is familiar to me, this sort of trap of resentment, and maybe it's familiar to you as well. I think it's one that we can all fall into. Anyone who's worked in ministry or service in general is probably familiar with this. If you're a parent, you might know this experience as well. I think at some point we have all probably begun to lose our temper or become impatient or said or done something uncharitable to the very people that we are trying to love and to serve. If you've ever lost your temper with your children or gotten in an argument with your spouse, become frustrated with your students or a patient if you're in the healthcare profession, or even with a parishioner in my own case or in those in ministry. We can all, in our desire to serve and to love, suddenly lose track of it all and instead fall into uncharity. And so the struggle is very real. And if you find yourself there, you're certainly not alone, and Martha is with us in that. But in the midst of all this, our second reading seems to come in out of left field, and it doesn't seem to make sense at first, and yet in it actually lies the key to resolving all of this. In our second reading, Paul said, "Brothers and sisters, I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I am filling up what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ." This is probably the opposite sentiment of Martha in every possible way. In her sufferings, Martha has become discouraged, resentful, but in his sufferings, Paul is rejoicing. And so we have to ask, what is the difference? What allows Paul to rejoice and Martha not to? And maybe the key is that word that Jesus says, "Martha, there is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, and it will not be taken from her." What is that one thing that Paul has that Martha is struggling or lost track of? It's this focus on Jesus. It's this orientation of all things back to Christ. Paul says he rejoices because he is sharing in the sufferings of Christ. Paul sees all his difficulties, all his trials as uniting him to Jesus. He recognizes that Jesus is with him in the midst of all those struggles, and that in fact there's a deeper union with the Lord precisely in the struggle. Mary also does this in her own way. She sits at the feet of Jesus. Her eyes are fixed on the Lord. And Martha, like many of us, has become distracted and loses track of what it's all about. The fact is that Jesus is a real person, and like any person, sometimes he wants us to sit with him and to be present without accomplishing anything. But if we're preoccupied with our own plans and agendas and visions, we're not listening to Jesus. We're listening to ourselves. If we've reduced our faith down to nothing more than a list of commandments or boxes to check, often we're too antsy to sit with the Lord, to be still with him. And this is certainly a challenge for me and perhaps for you as well. It's important to note that this is not a prohibition against work or service in general. Again, remember that first reading. Abraham and Sarah work very hard, very quickly. They're running around, getting things ready. And so it's not that their work and activity is bad. But there's a little detail in our first reading, maybe you noticed it, that Abraham and Sarah come up with this idea to serve, but then they turn to the Lord. They say, is this okay? I'd like to serve you. I'd like to prepare a meal. Is that okay? In other words, they check with the Lord to say, is my vision your vision? Is my plan your plan? And then once they realize that they've conformed their will to the Lord, then they follow through with great diligence and great effort. And so work is not bad, but if you find yourself become discouraged or resentful or impatient in your labors, if you're feeling abandoned or betrayed in your work to care for family or students or patients or parishioners or whomever you serve, then Jesus' invitation to Martha is also one to you as well and to myself. He invites us to pause from our labors, to come and sit before him, to listen to his word, to focus our eyes back on him, and to share with him our burdens and our worries, and then to receive his peace. And there's a couple ways that we can do this very practically. How do we actually put this into practice? One is what we're doing right now, keeping holy the Sabbath. When we go to Mass, we literally do exactly this. We pause from our labors to sit with the Lord, to focus our eyes on him, to hear his word in the scriptures, to receive him in the Eucharist, to behold him with our eyes. But another way we can do this as well is through prayer, especially Eucharistic adoration. I'm discovering we have chapels at both parishes that we serve. We also have adoration on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the evenings. What a great opportunity to sit with the Lord, to be present to him, and to reorient ourselves, to say, Lord, here are all my plans and projects. Here's all the things I'm carrying, but what is your will? How can I follow you? How can I reorient this all back to you? And so whether we're engaged in contemplation or in active labor, let's remain mindful of why we're doing these things and recognize the ultimate purpose is to love and serve the Lord. And this allows us to avoid that bitter resentment of burnout that Martha experiences, to persevere in our various work of ministry and service, and especially to grow closer to Jesus whom we encounter today in the Mass and in the Eucharist.